This week in Linux, there was a brand new version of the Linux kernel. Windows users have suffered a massive outage that continues to cause problems for a lot of people. There's some drama brewing related to the openSUSE brand and SUSE asking to have the project rename itself. Also, the executive director of the GNOME Foundation has announced that they are stepping down. All of this and so much more on This Week in Linux, the weekly news show that keeps you up to date with what's going on in the Linux and open source world. Now let's jump right into your source for Linux good news. This week in Linux, the Linux kernel has a new version released with Linus Torvalds announcing Linux 6.10 with a lot of new hardware support and improvements for existing hardware. And as with any new release, there are a lot of highlights to talk about. In fact, too many. So instead of going into all the details, we're going to talk about more details on Destination Linux, which is coming out later today. So be sure to check that out. So go to destinationlinux.net/380 for that. And let's now talk about the highlights of Linux 6.10. So Linux 6.10 brings faster AES XTS disk and file encryption for recent Intel and AMD CPUs, thanks to new implementations catering to AVX 512, VAES, and other modern CPU capabilities. Intel is also building in improved support for their upcoming Battle Mage GPUs, so they'll be ready to go for gamers on day one. AMD has also added some initial support for their Zen 5 processors in 6.10, and Zen 5 is not even out yet. Plus, there is now support for newer AMD GPUs on RISC-V platform built right into the kernel, and newer AMD Radeon graphics cards now have working display support on RISC-V systems. Linux 6.10 brings a new memory sealing system called mSeal. mSeal can be used by C libraries, web browsers, virtual machines, and more for memory sealing capabilities. Bcachefs, which is a very promising copy-on-write file system, saw improvements for this release of Linux kernel, and the Rust toolchain was upgraded to Rust 1.78, and other Rust in the kernel improvements, such as the kernel now allows for Rust RISC-V kernel builds. The Panther DRM driver is now upstreamed into Linux 6.10 for supporting newer ARM Mali graphics that require the firmware-based Command Stream Front End, or CSF, and also the ARM architecture receives support for Clang CFI, which is Control Flow Integrity, and many more things. As with every release of the Linux kernel, there are so many things that happened that there is just no way to cover it all. So if you'd like to check out the rest, you'll find links for more details in the show notes, as well as the coverage we had on Destination Linux, linked in the show notes. For a long time, people have worried that some evil hacker would take over the world's critical computers and cause a global outage that would cause damage on a scale so great that it would be referred to as a catastrophic event. Recently, a lot of the world was struck by a recent update that CrowdStrike Falcon had, which caused widespread disruptions and affecting various organizations globally, including airports, TV stations, and many, many more, such as hospitals and emergency services. So, guess we don't need to wait for a hacker to do this. The update has led to Windows systems entering boot loops or displaying the blue screen of death, impacting numerous services and industries. In fact, let's talk about some of the things that were impacted. We have emergency services, like several 911 services in the US and Canada were impacted, forcing some agencies to revert to paper-based operations. Airports worldwide experienced significant disruptions, grounding flights and causing delays, and some reports say that more than 5,000 flights were canceled in a day and continue to see cancels. Also, with hospitals and healthcare facilities in the Netherlands, Spain, and US reporting issues, it's a big deal. And also, of course, there's a variety of other things like the television stations Sky News and ABC suffered disruptions as their computers crashed. Corporate impact is basically uncountable because companies around the globe reported being affected by the outage, with the stock exchanges in London being down and payment processors having issues, causing problems for an uncountable amount of industries and people. because it didn't even matter if they were using Windows or CrowdStrike, because with the payment processors being down, they couldn't perform any business services and therefore couldn't do any transactions. So retail companies that have nothing to do with Windows or CrowdStrike still could be affected by this. And let's talk about the technical details related to this outage. CrowdStrike identified that a channel file within the Falcon update was causing the crashes. This file, a crucial component for the sensor, led to the issues being deployed. To quote George Kurtz, president and CEO of CrowdStrike, he confirmed the issue was due to a defect in a single content update. He assured that the problematic file has been reverted and a fix is available. Despite the quick response from CrowdStrike, the fallout from this update is expected to cause prolonged issues for many organizations. The complexity of dealing with large fleets of computers, remote workers, and cloud environments will require significant effort from IT departments and admins worldwide. So they're bracing for a challenging period ahead. A lot of people have been able to resolve the disruptions, but there are still people trying to get back to normal. So while it is possible to fix this issue and the process isn't that complicated to perform, it typically would require a technician to do it, because the average user wouldn't know how to perform the task of going into safe boot, going into the System32 folder, removing a specific file. I mean, this results in massive downtimes for large companies waiting for repairs to be made due to just how many machines were affected. For those impacted, you probably already know how to fix it, but if not, you'll find the instructions linked in the show notes. And if you're curious about learning more, you'll find more details linked there as well. SUSE has requested that the openSUSE project consider rebranding to distinguish more clearly between SUSE the company and openSUSE as a community project. This request has sparked discussions about the future governance and direction of openSUSE, but no specific proposals or timelines have been set as of this moment. The openSUSE name was adopted after Novell acquired SUSE in 2006 and has been used for the community project since then. The project operates under a board appointed by SUSE, with some members elected by the community, but lacks an independent organization for managing things like trademarks, infrastructure, and financial contributions. On July 7th, the openSUSE board member Sean Dunn opened a discussion following a talk at the openSUSE conference of this year by SUSE employees Robert Serchia, sorry if I said that wrong, and Richard Brown, who suggested that rebranding could reduce confusion between the SUSE and openSUSE brands. Now, reactions to this rebranding request have been mixed. Some community members view it as SUSE leveraging the community's work without sufficient protections, while others argue that shared branding creates confusion and competition between the brands. The discussion has also raised concerns about governance and the role of the Geeko Foundation, which handles openSUSE-specific activities. There are calls for a more formalized and independent organizational structure at this moment. While there is some support for rebranding and governance changes, the next steps are unclear at the moment. The community needs to decide on the timing, method for selecting a new name, and whether SUSE will support establishing a separate legal entity for openSUSE. Resolving these issues promptly and transparently is crucial for the project's continued success. And I have a lot to say about this topic because this is right in my wheelhouse. For those who don't know, in addition to being a content creator and podcaster, I have many years of experience as a marketer. So I have a ton to say, but if I were to dive into that right now, this episode of Twill would be at least 2 or 3 times larger than usual. So I think that I'll have to, we still have more than half of the show left to do. So I've decided to make a separate video on this particular topic so I can go more in depth on it, which I hope you'll enjoy, and maybe it will help openSUSE with their dilemma. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss it. The GNOME Foundation has announced that Holly Million will step down executive director on July 31st of this year, just 9 months after her inauguration. Richard Littauer is the veteran in the open source community, and he will be assuming the role of interim executive director to ensure a smooth transition. Now, during her brief tenure, Million made significant strides for GNOME. including a 5-year strategic plan, which she drafted a comprehensive plan to guide the foundation's future, and also fiscal sponsorship agreements. Specifically, there's multiples, but also some for very interesting with the GIMP project and the Black Python devs. Also, there was financial management efforts with implementing a break-even budget and strengthening the foundation's financial reserves. In her farewell message, Millian expressed pride in her achievements and shared her future plans. She says, "I'm very proud of what I have accomplished. I will be pursuing a PhD in psychology and dedicating myself to my own private practice." The GNOME Board of Directors expressed gratitude to Millian for her dynamic leadership and strategic initiatives that have positioned the foundation for future success. The board plans to search for a permanent executive director and will provide further details following the GWADEC conference, which is happening right now. I'm disappointed this is how it ended because, for those who don't know, Millian's primary occupation as a professional shaman became a fact that puzzled some people in the open source community as an indicator or a lack of experience in open source projects. And this is annoying because, as a quick reminder, the executive director of the GNOME Foundation is not a technical role, and the person selecting does not have to be a technical person to do that job. The GNOME Foundation is a nonprofit organization, and the purpose of the executive director is to do basically fundraising duties for the foundation. Holly's professional experience included fundraising for nonprofit organizations, which made very clear that she is qualified for that role. And her being able to accomplish what she did in less than a year, it's a shame we didn't get to see what she could have done with a few years at the helm. So, Holly, I wish you all the best. And for those who gave Holly a hard time for no apparent reason other than you don't understand what that job is for, you need to do better. NVIDIA has announced its plans to fully transition to open source GPU kernels with the release of NVIDIA 560 graphics driver for Linux. This marks a significant milestone in NVIDIA's journey towards open source, which began 2 years ago with the release of their first Linux graphics driver featuring open source GPU kernel modules. Over the past 2 years, NVIDIA's open kernel modules have been enhanced with numerous features, including heterogeneous memory management support, or HMM, confidential computing, coherent memory architectures of NVIDIA's Grace platforms, and others. These advancements have made the open source modules robust and ready for mainstream adoption. Now, while the open source GPU kernel modules are compatible with NVIDIA's Turing, Ampere, Ada Lovelace, and Hopper architectures, they do not yet support Maxwell, Pascal, and Volta architectures. For these older architectures, NVIDIA recommends continuing to use the proprietary drivers. And also, conversely, the cutting-edge platforms like NVIDIA's Grace Hopper and NVIDIA Blackwell will only be supported by the open-source GPU kernel modules, which is fantastic news for what is potential coming ahead. And I quote, "2 years on, we've achieved equivalent or better application performance with our open-source GPU kernel modules and added substantial new capabilities," said NVIDIA in their blog post. Also, they go on to say, "We're now at a point where transitioning fully to the open source GPU kernel modules is the right move, and we're making that change in the upcoming R560 driver release." Now, the recent NVIDIA 555 graphics driver series introduced explicit GPU sync support, a significant milestone that enhances the Wayland desktop experience for NVIDIA users. With the upcoming 560 driver, Linux users can anticipate an even better graphic experience with NVIDIA with more open source components, further improving compatibility and performance across various applications. And in my opinion, this is great news from NVIDIA, and I'm happy to see them make this transition, especially since people have been asking them to do exactly this for decades. And to see it finally happening to some degree is just awesome. But NVIDIA are saying that they're going fully open source for their kernel modules. And some people are saying they're going fully open source, and that is not correct. Because that doesn't mean they're going fully open source, they're just going fully open source for the kernel modules. Unlike Intel, where everything is open source, and unlike AMD, where almost everything is open source, the user space drivers for NVIDIA are still closed source. Now, this is still great news and is very promising toward the future, but we're not quite there yet for a fully open source NVIDIA experience. But it looks like that is a possibility that could happen, and I'm very excited for that. So if you'd like to learn more about this news, you'll find links in the show notes. After several delays due to bugs, waiting on updates from KDE, Mesa, GNOME, and the NVIDIA 555 drivers to be available, Nobara 40 is now released. The transition from 38 to 39 was a bit challenging, so the team focused on ensuring a smooth and stable version for Nobara 40. For those unaware, Nobara is a Linux distro created by the individual who you may have heard the name of, the one and only Glorious Eggroll. If you haven't heard of him, then you probably are not a gamer, because otherwise that would be shocking if you hadn't. Before we get into what's new with Nobara, I wanted to let you know, if you didn't have a chance to watch it already, we recently interviewed Lord Glorious of the Eggroll on my podcast, Destination Linux, and it was a ton of fun. So if you want to check that out, go to destinationlinux.net/370. Now let's talk about Nobara 40. So there's been a lot of updates to talk about. We're going to be able to cover everything, but we'll do as many as possible with the highlights. So there's system updates, Flatpak updates, and snap improvements, and that sort of stuff. So let's talk about the update to the system app. They've completely remade it into a Python GUI application. They've added better integration with Nobara Package Manager, and now includes a system tray app for update notifications. Also, the Nobara Package Manager now supports full search, install, and removal of Flatpaks through a user-friendly GUI, eliminating the need for KDE Discover or GNOME software in their implementation. Also, there's improvements to the snap support with fixes for issues preventing the operation of various different types of apps from snaps. The Nobara Driver Manager has been introduced with limited functionality, but is planned to be expanded upon for hardware needing third-party driver support and that sort of thing. They've also reworked the KDE theme to avoid conflicts with other themes and settings. They've made some improvements to the Papyrus dark icons set. They've also included a Starship shell prompt as part of the KDE theme, offering a clean, themable shell prompt without changing the shell itself. Also, there's been a lot of updates to various different packages, including desktop environments. So KDE Plasma has been updated to 6.1.1. GNOME has been updated to GNOME 46. And also with the underlying drivers, the Mesa graphics drivers have been updated to version 24.1.3 with regular updates to the Mesa Vulkan drivers. Also, the NVIDIA drivers have been updated to 555.58.02 for the NVIDIA support on Wayland. And also, there's a lot of gaming improvements, of course, because that's basically what Nobara is for. It's a gaming-based distribution on top of Fedora, for those who are not familiar with that. And it's a very cool thing. So let's talk about what's new on the gaming side. So there's some improvements to Lutris. It is now built regularly from Git. Also, the Umu launcher is now packaged and available in repositories, which is a very cool project, which also is made by Glorious Eggroll. We talked about the Umu launcher inside of the episode of the interview for Destination Linux, so go check that out for more details. But basically, it's like using Proton for anything, so go check it out. It's a very cool topic and a very cool interview. Destination Linux 370. Also, Mango HUD has been updated to version 0.7.2. G-Overlay or Goverlay has been updated to version 1.1.1. And there's been many patches and tweaks to improve the performance for Steam. They've also done some cool stuff for content creators. OBS Studio has been updated to 30.2 with several plugins and patches, including HDR support in VK Capture plugin. And also the DaVinci Resolve runtime is provided by the Nobara team, and it works with Resolve 18.6. And DaVinci Resolve is a fantastic video editor, which I use for this show. So that's important for me. And there's a whole lot more. If you want to check out Nobara 40, you'll find a link in the show notes. And there you will also find a link to the interview we had with Glorious Eggroll on Destination Linux 370. The Solus project has announced the removal of the App Armor patch set from the Linux kernel version 6.9 in their current branch. This is signaling a shift towards Flatpak as the preferred software installation framework and phasing out the Snap package support. Evan Maddock from the Solus team highlighted several benefits of this decision. He says that they're reducing maintenance because the AppArmor patch set comprises over 60 separate patches. So Evan says the removal of this extensive patch set alleviates the maintenance burden. Also, Solus can now update to new kernel versions faster without waiting for Canonical to update the AppArmor patches. And this is obviously a shift to Flatpak. And Solus is now focusing on Flatpak, which is a widely supported framework integrated with major desktop environments like GNOME and KDE Plasma. And Flatpak versus Snaps, well, while Snap is mainly used by Canonical on Ubuntu and Ubuntu-based derivatives, Flatpak has gained a preference across most other Linux distros, becoming kind of like the de facto standard for distro-agnostic software formats. So there are various things that relate to the transition period because they're using some migration tools. Solus has introduced some tools and documentation to facilitate the transition from snaps to Flatpaks, including the unsnap package, which basically guides you across finding Flatpaks for the snaps that you have, simplifying the migration process. Also, there's going to still be snap support for at least a little while. They're going to continue the support through the end of 2024, but users are encouraged to explore Flatpak alternatives to the apps they use. Also, Snap Package support will still exist, but without AppArmor, Snap Packages will operate under a partial confinement rather than a strict confinement, potentially exposing users to, security risks and that sort of stuff. Solus has introduced a warning system in the Snap command tool to alert users when strict confinement is not active, so that's pretty good at least. The removal of the AppArmor patch set and the shift towards Flatpak marks a significant change for Solus. And I think this is an interesting move from Solus, but it does make sense to reduce the maintenance burden as they explained. And overall, Flatpaks are getting more and more popular as a format. And personally, I don't really have a preference over Flatpak or Snaps or App Images overall. If a developer chooses to use one of those formats, I appreciate it because as long as they're supporting the Linux platform, I get to use their app, I'm okay with whatever they pick. But I do typically look for Flatpak first if I can. So this is pretty cool to see, a lot more distributions adopting Flatpaks. And it does seem like it's a very, de facto standard at this point. Although Ubuntu is still snaps only unless you manually install Flatpak support yourself. So there is that difference between, user experience and that sort of stuff. So overall, I think this is good. Hopefully Ubuntu implements Flatpak support out of the box at some point, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. If you'd like to learn more about the latest news from Solus, you'll find links in the show notes. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on this show and want to be kept up to date with what's going on in the Linux and open source world, then be sure to subscribe. And of course, remember to like that smash button. If you'd like to support the show and the Tux Digital Network, then consider becoming a patron by going to tuxdigital.com/membership. We're going to get a bunch of cool perks like access to patron-only sections of our Discord server and much, much more. You can also support the show by ordering the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt or the This Week in Linux shirt at tuxdigital.com/store. Plus, while you're there, check out all the other great stuff we have like hats, mugs, hoodies, and so much more at tuxdigital.com/store. I'll see you next time for another episode of your source for Linux news. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tunnell. I hope you're doing swell. Be sure to ring that notification bell. And until next time, I bid you farewell.